It happened in an instant, one of those moments that felt less like politics and more like a carefully rehearsed insult designed to sting. Senator Marsha Blackburn leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension, as she took aim not at the argument on the table, but at the intelligence of Representative Jasmine Crockett herself. It wasn't policy. It wasn't facts. It was personal, and the chamber knew it. The words sliced through the air, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any debate rulebook could contain. Reporters shifted in their seats. Mid-note. The smirk that crept across Blackburn's face told the whole story. This wasn't just about scoring political points. It was about humiliation. It was about reminding a younger, black congresswoman of where Blackburn thought she belonged. For a moment, all you could hear was the faint shuffle of papers. The room, packed with history and cameras, suddenly felt like a stage where only one actress was relishing her line. The insult lingered, echoing louder in the quiet than it had when first delivered. It was the kind of dismissal that generations of women, immigrants, and outsiders know, to wealth a smug suggestion that brilliance must justify itself to arrogance. But as the cameras zoomed in, they caught something else. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or fire back in anger. Her stillness was its own kind of defiance, a calm so deliberate that it unsettled more than a shout ever could. You could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. The measured patience of someone who had spent her life walking into rooms where people doubted her before she spoke a word. Every lens captured Blackburn's self-satisfied grin, the slight arch of her brow, the whisper of a laugh that was less humor and more cruelty. But in politics, as in history, moments that begin with arrogance rarely end the way the aggressor imagines, because what the room didn't know, what Blackburn herself didn't see, was that silence can be strategy. And Crockett's silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She was preparing the kind of response that would leave the chamber stunned. What might have seemed, on the surface, like just another insult inside. The marble halls of Congress was, in truth, something much larger. Blackburn's words carried more than personal malice. They tapped into a deep, familiar wound in American life, the reflexive dismissal of women, of people of color, of voices that refused to bow to old hierarchies. It wasn't just Crockett who was being belittled. It was the millions who have seen their intelligence questioned, their accents mocked, their credentials ignored. In that single swipe, Blackburn turned a political sparring match into a cultural flashpoint. And this wasn't the first time. Blackburn had made a career of sharp barbs, often wrapped in a smile that felt more like a sneer. To her supporters, it was confidence. To her critics, it was arrogance and eagerness to belittle rather than debate. Clips of her interruptions and dismissive quips had long circulated online, earning her headlines for being tough, but also accusations of condescension, especially toward women who dared challenge her. This moment fit the pattern perfectly. The seasoned senator brushing off a younger colleague, assuming the audience would laugh with her rather than recoil. But Jasmine Crockett was not just any younger colleague. She was part of a new generation of lawmakers who carried not only their resumes, but also their identities into the chamber, identities that had too often been wielded against them. Crockett's very presence was a statement. A black woman lawyer from Texas, unapologetic, in style, unafraid of speaking truth to power. To underestimate her was to underestimate the communities she represented, the histories she carried, and the dignity she refused to compromise. That was what gave the insult such gravity. This was not a clash of egos. It was a collision between two visions of America, one clinging to hierarchy and dismissiveness, the other demanding respect, demanding recognition, demanding space. Viewers watching from home knew it. Social feeds began to buzz within minutes of the clip leaking. People typed furiously, "There it is again. This is how they always talk to us." This is why representation matters. In that silence following Blackburn's remark, tension rippled far beyond the chamber, became a mirror for workplaces where women are spoken over, for classrooms where immigrants are underestimated, for families who have had to fight twice as hard to prove what should have been obvious from the start. Blackburn may have thought she was targeting Crockett alone, but the sting was collective, And yet, for all the outrage in the air, there was also uncertainty. Too often these moments come and go in Washington and insult lands. Cameras capture it, pundits move on, and the arrogance wins by default. Maybe this, too, would pass. Maybe Crockett would simply swallow the slight, chalk it up to the game, and return to business as usual. But the chamber did not yet understand the patience of someone underestimated. They did not yet grasp that silence could be a weapon sharper than Blackburn's quip. Because Crockett wasn't planning to let this one slide, and just when it seemed like another Washington insult would go unanswered. To understand the sting of Blackburn's insult, you have to understand Marsha Blackburn herself. For years, she has cultivated a reputation not just as a senator, but as a fighter who relishes confrontation. On the campaign trail, she brands herself as the unwavering defender of Tennessee values, as a straight-talking conservative who won't be bullied by Washington elites. But peel back that glossy branding. It's in a different picture. Emerges a portrait of a politician who often mistakes cruelty for toughness, dismissal for wit, and condescension for confidence. Her political persona has long been wrapped in contradiction. She champions respect for all Americans, yet time and again, her sharpest moments have come not from elevating debate but from cutting down her opponents. Blackburn's name surfaces in viral clips not because of groundbreaking policy arguments, but because of her barbed tongue. In one Senate hearing, she interrupted witnesses with smirks and loaded questions, her tone suggesting the answers didn't matter as much as the spectacle of asking them. In another exchange, she brushed off a colleague's nuanced explanation with a single snide comment that drew laughs from her allies, but groans across social media. The pattern was clear. Blackburn thrived on belittlement. Whether it was a young activist testifying about climate change, a legal expert explaining constitutional law, or a fellow senator speaking with lived experience, Blackburn's reflex was the same: undermine, diminish, trivialize. To her base, these moments played as strength. Here was someone unafraid to speak her mind. But to millions of others, they read as arrogance. A woman so sure of her own superiority that she need not listen, only sneer. This contradiction is what made her insult toward Crockett sting with such familiarity. It wasn't new behavior. It was part of a script. And in that script, Blackburn always cast herself as the authority, the gatekeeper, the voice of experience against the supposedly unqualified. She had played this role so often that perhaps she believed it was unshakable. The media noticed long ago. Commentators often described her as combative, euphemism for the kind of dismissiveness that erases dialogue rather than invites it. Late-night shows clipped her sharpest exchanges, framing them as entertainment political theater with Blackburn as the antagonist the audience loved to boo. Memes depicted her eye rolls and raised brows, symbols of a politician less interested in persuasion than in performance. Even among her colleagues, whispers suggested that working with Blackburn meant bracing for barbs, disguised as questions. But perhaps the most glaring contradiction of all was how she balanced her talk of traditional Southern manners with a style that reveled in public put-downs. She spoke of civility while perfecting the art of televised incivility. She invoked dignity while denying it to others. Too many watching, her brand of values seemed less about respect and more about hierarchy. Who gets to be heard? Who gets dismissed? And who must constantly prove they belong? So when Blackburn leaned forward to question Jasmine Crockett's intelligence, it was not just one more insult in a long list. It was the performance of an old habit, a routine she had refined over years. The condescension wasn't an accident. It was her signature move. And yet, there was something different about this moment. Maybe it was the generational clash. Veteran senator against a rising representative. Maybe it was the racial undertone, the unspoken weight of a white politician questioning the intellect of a black woman on national television. Or maybe it was the smirk, that look of certainty, that the audience would laugh with her, not at her. Whatever it was, it carried an edge sharper than usual. The silence that followed was more chilling than even Blackburn anticipated. Because arrogance can entertain for only so long before it collapses under its own weight. Audiences might enjoy the theatrics, but deep down, they yearn for the moment when the antagonist meets her match. They crave the reversal, the scene where the villain's confidence becomes her undoing. Blackburn had written herself into that role so perfectly that all it would take was one opponent refusing to play along for the script to flip. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and unshaken, was about to flip it. But if Blackburn thought she was picking on an easy target, she had no idea what was coming. To grasp the full power of what was unfolding in that chamber, you have to know who Jasmine Crockett is. Not just the congresswoman sitting under the weight of Blackburn's insult, but the woman shaped long before that moment ever arrived. Hers is not the story of privilege or shortcuts. It's the story of grit, of persistence. A voice that was told time and again it didn't belong, yet rose anyway. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up in a household that prized resilience. She was not handed an easy path. She worked her way through school, balancing studies with jobs that paid the bills, all while carrying the quiet knowledge that people like her were rarely invited to the tables of power. But rather than internalize that limitation, she turned it into fuel. Education was her weapon, her shield, her way of proving that brilliance could never be confined to a zip code or a pedigree. That determination led her to the University of Houston and later to law school at Thurgood Marshall School of Law, institution named for a man who himself had turned the law into a weapon for justice. Crockett absorbed that legacy. She didn't pursue law for prestige, she pursued it for people. Early legal career was not spent in corporate towers, but in courtrooms where ordinary citizens fought for dignity. She defended the poor, the marginalized, the overlooked of fun, taking on cases that bigger firms deemed unworthy. Her clients weren't names in headlines. They were neighbors, working parents, young men facing stacked odds. For Crockett, their battles were her battles. It was in those courtrooms that her steel was forged. Judges underestimated her. Opposing lawyers scoffed at her youth, her gender, her style. Yet time after time, she dismantled them not with theatrics, but with preparation, sharp logic, and a calm that unnerved those who expected her to break. She learned early that arrogance feeds on reaction. Silence, followed by precision, was her deadliest strategy. That instinct would later serve her in Washington. But her journey didn't stop with the law. Crockett saw that systemic problems required systemic answers. So she stepped into the realm of activism and politics, where she became a familiar face at community rallies and a fierce advocate in the Texas legislature. She spoke for those who rarely had a microphone, the families pushed out of housing, the women denied health care, the workers scraping by on wages that barely kept lights on. Every speech she gave wasn't just about policy. It was about people. Her authenticity wasn't polished, it was lived when she ran for Congress. Few in the establishment thought she had a chance. She was up against seasoned names, entrenched networks, the weight of skepticism. But Crockett had something harder to defeat: the trust of her community. She had walked their streets, fought their cases, stood with them in protests. Voters recognized her not as a polished politician, but as one of their own. And so, against the odds, she rose first to the Texas House, then to the halls of Congress. Even in Washington, the underestimation never stopped. Pundits dismissed her as too fiery, colleagues whispered that she was unpolished, and critics accused her of being more activist than legislator. Yet Crockett wore those labels as armor. They revealed more about the discomfort of her detractors than about her own capability. She refused to sand down her edges for approval. She was there to represent, not to assimilate, and that's what made her clash with Blackburn so charged. Crockett had lived a lifetime of moments where her intelligence, her presence, her right to belong had been questioned. She had been patronized by judges, mocked by opponents, doubted by voters. Every time she had chosen dignity over rage, preparation over performance, and every time her critics underestimated her, only to discover their mistake too late. The chamber that day was not her first battlefield. It was simply the grandest stage yet. And as cameras captured her calm, as Blackburn smirked with smug certainty, Crockett carried within her the weight of all those past dismissals. To the world, it may have looked like silence. But to Crockett, it was the same silence she had held before, delivering a closing argument that flipped a courtroom. before standing on a debate stage and winning over a crowd, before proving again and again that she belonged. This wasn't her first time being underestimated, but it might be her most important. Because here, under the glare of national cameras, Crockett's composure wasn't just about herself. It was about every young woman told she wasn't smart enough. Every black professional questioned about credentials. Every immigrant child asked to prove their worth. Her response would not just belong to her, it would belong to all of them. And so, as the chamber held its breath, Crockett's stillness became a promise. A promise that arrogance would not have the last word. The insult had already landed. Room knew it. The air was tight with discomfort. Colleagues shifting in their seats, staffers suddenly fascinated by their notes. But Marsha Blackburn wasn't finished. Blackburn leaned forward, her voice sharpening like a blade against stone. She doubled down, pressing the same dismissive tone that had defined so many of her past exchanges. Was mentioned, it came wrapped in condescension. Every question was less about substance and more about authority, an older senator flaunting her seniority, almost daring the younger congresswoman to challenge her. But Crockett didn't take the bait. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she sat in silence, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. To some, it might have looked like passivity. To those who knew her, it was calculation. The contrast was striking. Blackburn's voice grew louder, her interruptions more pointed. She gestured with clipped movements, the kind meant to dominate. Crockett, by comparison, was still a figure of unshakable calm. The louder Blackburn got, the more commanding Crockett's silence became, and the room felt it. A senator to the left shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women as though silently urging the exchange to end. A congressional aide seated just behind scribbled furiously, aware that history might be unfolding. Even reporters, seasoned veterans of political sparring, leaned forward with a different kind of alertness. This wasn't the usual DC noise. This was something else. Blackburn pressed on. Congresswoman, maybe if you spent less time grandstanding and more time studying the issues, you'd understand what's at stake here. A gasp, almost inaudible, fluttered through the chamber. It wasn't the insult itself Washington had heard far worse. It was the way it landed on Crockett, who still hadn't spoken. Her silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was suspense, and Blackburn couldn't see it. The senator mistook the quiet for surrender. She pressed harder, piling interruption upon interruption, remark upon remark. Each one rang with a familiar edge, dismissive, belittling, meant to establish dominance. Yet with every word, she was carving herself deeper into a corner, because while Crockett was quiet, the cameras were not. They captured every smirk, every pointed jab, every gesture of superiority. For the millions who would later watch Blackburn wasn't controlling the room, she was unraveling in it. Crockett's restraint turned the dynamic on its head. Her silence began to feel like a mirror, reflecting Blackburn's tone back to her with unflinching clarity. The more Blackburn talked, the more isolated she seemed, and that's when the energy shifted. You could almost feel it ripple through the chamber. The frustration of the audience, whether in the room or watching later, was building. People weren't just annoyed at Blackburn's interruptions. They were yearning for a response. They wanted the silence to break. They wanted to see the moment turn. But Crockett waited. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most devastating response isn't immediate. It's perfectly timed. Blackburn, meanwhile, carried on as though she were delivering a closing argument no one had asked. 4. Her voice rose, her tone hardened, her interruptions stacked on top of each other. At one point, she even laughed, as though mocking the very idea that Crockett could pose a challenge. The laugh was the breaking point. Around the chamber, shoulders stiffened. Pens stopped moving. Even those who weren't allies of Crockett seemed to recognize the imbalance. What had begun as a political sparring match now looked like something uglier, a test of dignity itself. And still, Crockett sat silently. Every second felt longer than the last. The suspense grew unbearable. Blackburn continued, oblivious, digging deeper into her role as antagonist. But the silence wasn't going to last forever, because Crockett wasn't ignoring the insults. She was absorbing them. And in that stillness, she was gathering her power. The cameras zoomed closer. The microphones hummed, waiting, and then finally Crockett leaned into the microphone. The silence had reached its peak, every second stretched like a taut string ready to snap. And then, deliberate, steady, the calm authority of someone who had endured enough, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. Her voice sliced through the tension like a clean blade. "Senator Blackburn," she began, her tone almost conversational. "I know dismissiveness can sound clever when you're used to delivering it unchallenged. But let's make sure we're clear about who's sitting across from you." The room stilled again. A ripple of anticipation moved through the chamber. Blackburn stiffened slightly, sensing something shift. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. "I graduated from law school with honors. I built my career as a public defender, fighting for people this system often forgets. When families couldn't afford an attorney, I stood beside them. Young men of color were written off as statistics. I fought for their names, their dignity, their freedom. That's the foundation I came here with. And in this Congress, I've authored legislation, I've debated policy, and I've delivered. For the people of Texas, because that's what they sent me here to do." She paused, letting the words hang. A faint murmur spread across the chamber. "I don't need to trade insults to prove my intelligence." Crockett pressed on, "Because my record speaks louder than your ridicule. Let me be very clear, my intelligence isn't measured by your approval. It's measured by the communities I've served, the lives I've changed, and the battles I've won, not for myself but for the people." The shift was unmistakable. Blackburn's smirk faltered. She shifted in her chair, her pen tapping just a little too quickly against the table. Crockett leaned in closer, her tone now edged with righteous fire. "You speak of studying issues, Senator, as though I walked into this chamber unprepared. But let me remind you, I have lived the issues you only read about in briefing books. I have sat across from mothers begging for justice for their children. I have worked cases that revealed just how fragile our promise of equality really is. So no, I don't need a lecture from someone who has mistaken arrogance for authority." Gasps fluttered through the chamber. The staffers behind the members froze mid-scribble, their eyes widening. Reporters whispered to one another, their fingers racing to capture the moment. Crockett's voice grew steadier, stronger, fueled not by anger, but by conviction. "You see, Senator, when you try to belittle me, you are not just aiming at me. You're aiming at every woman who has ever had to prove she belongs in a room built to exclude her. You're aiming at every black professional who has had to work twice as hard to get half the credit. You're aiming at every young person watching this chamber and wondering if they'll ever be taken seriously. So understand this, your insult is bigger than me, but so is my answer." The murmurs grew louder now, like a low tide sweeping across the chamber. Even some of Blackburn's allies avoided her gaze. Crockett pressed the advantage, layering fact upon fact. "My education, documented my career, tested in courtrooms where the stakes were life or death. My service is on the record for every constituent who has trusted me to fight for them. And what's yours, Senator? A string of dismissive remarks, a reputation for belittling opponents, and a pattern of treating debate as theater instead of responsibility." She let the words sink in, the contrast drawn like a sharp line across the room. Then came the pivot, the moral framing that lifted, the moment above politics. Because here's the truth. Democracy doesn't survive on smugness. It survives on ideas. It survives on the courage to listen, to argue on substance, to respect differences even when they cut deep. When you reduce this chamber to a place of personal insults, you diminish not me, but the people who put their faith in all of us. And frankly, they deserve better. It was no longer just a rebuttal. It was an indictment. Blackburn's face tightened, her jaw set in the kind of forced composure that betrayed its own fragility. Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in again, her voice a steady drumbeat. "I came here knowing I would be underestimated, be spoken over, doubted, dismissed. But here's what you don't understand. I've lived my entire life being underestimated. And every single time I've proven people wrong. That's not a weakness. That's my strength. The chamber was. No longer just watching, it was riveted. Members leaned forward in their seats, caught between awe and disbelief. And then Crockett delivered the closing strike, the line that crystallized the entire exchange into one unforgettable moment. She raised her chin, her voice ringing clear. And final, when you can't match ideas, you resort to insultsome that says everything. Silence. A heavy, stunned silence that swallowed the chamber whole. Then the reaction broke. A low murmur of voices, the sound of chairs shifting, the incredulous expressions of colleagues trying to mask their shock. A reporter whispered, "That's the quote?" already typing furiously. A young staffer's eyes widened, knowing she had just witnessed the kind of moment that would replay across news cycles for days, maybe weeks, and Blackburn. For the first time in the exchange, she had no words. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting to the papers before her as if they might provide cover. The smirk was gone. The laughter gone. What remained was a silence heavier than any insult she had thrown. Crockett sat back in her chair, her expression calm once more, as though the eruption of power had cost her nothing. It was the composure of someone who had been here before, who knew that true strength didn't come from volume or venom, but from truth spoken at exactly the right time, in that chamber. One narrative ended, and another began. Blackburn had thrown the insult, but Crockett had claimed the moment. And for everyone watching, whether in the gallery on screens or in the quiet corners of social media feeds, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just about a senator and a congresswoman. It was about dignity, refusing to bow to arrogance. It was about the underestimated rising to redefine the stage. It was about every voice that had ever been told to sit down finally standing tall. And as the echoes of Crockett's words lingered, in the chamber, one truth was clear. Marsha Blackburn had tried to script the scene as her victory. But Jasmine Crockett had just rewritten the story. The moment Crockett's words left her lips, the chamber may have fallen into silence, but the outside world did anything but. Within minutes, the clip had escaped the confines of Capitol Hill, carried first by reporters' tweets and then by the wildfire mechanics of the internet. What began as a 30-second exchange became a cultural moment. Replayed, remixed, and reframed across every timeline. The hashtags were immediate. Hashtag Crockett Clapback trended within an hour, followed closely by hashtag Dignity Wins and hashtag Mic Drop in Congress. Users posted the same clip again and again, zooming in on Blackburn's smirk fading, highlighting Crockett's steady gaze, and replaying that final devastating line. When you can't match ideas, you resort to insultsome that says everything memes. Followed swiftly. One showed Blackburn's face dissolving like dust in a Marvel movie, with the caption, "Insults don't survive truth." Another compared Crockett's rebuttal to a courtroom drama, the kind where the unexpected witness delivers the testimony. That changes everything. TikTok creators layered Crockett's voice over triumphant soundtracks, syncing the final line to beat drops and slow-motion edits. Commentators piled in too. Progressive anchors called it a masterclass in composure, while columnists labeled it the clapback heard around Washington. Even typically dry political podcasts broke format to gush about the rhetorical precision, marveling at how Crockett had turned an insult into a national lesson on dignity. It wasn't just what she said, one analyst remarked. It was how she said it. Calm, steady, undeniable. But it wasn't just allies who weighed in. Some conservative pundits tried to dismiss the moment as overblown theater, accusing Crockett of playing the victim. Yet even in their criticism, they couldn't escape replaying the clip, inadvertently spreading it further. One right-wing commentator sighed live on air. "Well, let's be honest, Blackburn didn't exactly come out on top here." Celebrities joined the chorus. Viola Davis tweeted, "That's how you hold power accountable, with grace and fire." Kerry Washington chimed in. "Jasmine Crockett just showed every young girl of color what strength looks like." Even athletes weighed, and LeBron James retweeted the clip with 3 flame emojis and the words, "respect." For activists, the moment carried deeper resonance. Groups fighting for racial justice and gender equity circulated Crockett's words as a rallying cry. "This isn't just about Congress," one organizer posted. "It's about every classroom, every boardroom, every courtroom where dignity has been dismissed." The exchange became a symbol of why representation mattered, not as a slogan, but as a lived, visible reality. Even rival politicians couldn't ignore it. A moderate Republican congressman, asked about the exchange on cable news, admitted, "Look, I don't agree with Crockett on most policies, but she handled herself with poise. I'll give her that." It was a rare moment of begrudging respect. That underscored just how lopsided the encounter had been. Meanwhile, social media lit up with personal stories. Young women posted about the times they had been underestimated in classrooms or offices, pairing their anecdotes with Crockett's. Final line. Immigrants spoke of being talked down to, only to prove their worth over and over again. The viral moment was no longer just Crockett's. It became a mirror in which countless people saw their own struggles and their own quiet victories. Cable news ran the footage on loop. Morning shows framed it as the exchange that left the Senate chamber stunned. Late-night comedians turned it into their opening monologues, replaying the insult, and then reveling in the comeback. One joked, if Blackburn thought she was holding the gavel, Crockett just dropped the hammer. Made the moment unstoppable wasn't just the virality, it was the clarity. In an age of constant spin and noise, Crockett's words cut through. There was no ambiguity, no muddle. It was the stark contrast between arrogance and dignity. Delivered live, captured on camera, and impossible to deny. And so the moment stretched. Beyond politics, it became shorthand for how people wanted debates to end, not with shouting, not with belittling, but with truth, calmly and firmly standing its ground. A cultural touchstone was born, one destined to live in highlight reels. A political history, but even as Twitter timelines blazed and late-night shows cheered, the story wasn't finished. Because the ripple effects weren't just online, the shockwaves reached into the halls of power themselves, shaking conversations at the highest levels of government. And soon, it would become clear this wasn't merely a viral clapback. It was the start of something much larger. But it wasn't just Twitter that lit up. The ripple effects reached the highest levels of government. When the noise of pundits and the frenzy of social media began to settle, what lingered wasn't just the viral clip or the witty hashtags. It was the resonance of something deeper, a reminder of what dignity looks like when it refuses to bend to arrogance. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended herself, she had reframed the entire confrontation into a lesson larger than politics. Calm precision, her refusal to trade insult for insult, revealed a truth as old as democracy itself. Intelligence. It's not measured by how loudly you speak or how cutting your put-downs sound. It's measured by the substance of your service, the courage of your convictions, and the respect you show even in the face of disrespect. That lesson struck a nerve because it transcended the chamber. For women who had been talked over in boardrooms, for immigrants whose accents were mocked in classrooms, for every worker dismissed by a smug superior, Crockett's stand felt like vindication. She showed that the power of dignity wasn't passive, was active. And capable of dismantling arrogance without raising its voice. This wasn't just a story of one congresswoman and one senator. It was a parable about how America moves forward, not through the arrogance of those clinging to old hierarchies, but through the steady insistence of those who have always been underestimated. Crockett's words echoed with a moral clarity that millions recognized in their own lives. When you cannot win on ideas, you resort to belittling. And when you resort to belittling, you reveal the weakness of your own position. It is no accident that her rebuttal felt like a mirror for so many. Representation, after all, is not just about who sits in the chamber. It's about who sees themselves reflected in that chamber. For the young girl of color watching from her living room, Crockett's composure said, "You belong here too." For the single mother fighting to be heard at her child's school, it said, "Your voice matters just as much as theirs." For the immigrant, worker dismissed as less than, it said, "Your story is part of America's story, and beyond those identities." It spoke to a universal hunger for fairness, for truth, for debates that lift instead of demean. People yearn for leaders who embody the best of us rather than the worst. In that moment, Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a vessel for the values so many Americans want to see restored: respect, courage, and unwavering dignity. The moral was not subtle, but neither was it heavy-handed. It was lived out in real time. Arrogance wilted, while dignity held its ground. And that is why the clip resonated far beyond Washington. It wasn't political theater. It was a human drama, and in that drama, people saw themselves not as powerless spectators, but as part of a larger movement toward respect. Because here's the enduring truth: when dignity stands firm, it doesn't just silence arrogance, it exposes it. Crockett's words left Blackburn speechless, but more importantly, they left millions inspired. They reminded America that intelligence is not about tearing others down. It is about building something that endures, something rooted in service and truth. That's the legacy of moments like these.
Outlast.
The viral cycle. They become stories parents tell their children, examples replayed in classrooms, lessons invoked by activists. They are proof that when arrogance tries to diminish, dignity always finds a way to rise higher. And perhaps that is why the chamber's silence that day was so profound. Because everyone watching understood. This was not just about who won an argument. It was about who defined what leadership should look like. Jasmine Crockett reminded America that true strength isn't loud, and true intelligence doesn't belittle. True strength is steady. True intelligence respects. And when tested, it always shines brighter than arrogance. Her stand turned an insult into a universal lesson, and in doing so, she gave America not just a rebuttal, but a reminder of who we can be at our best. The question that lingered was no longer what happened in that chamber. It was, what happens when that spirit reaches the rest of the nation? Marsha Blackburn may have come armed with a smirk and a cutting insult, but history won't remember the smirk. It will remember the silence that followed. It will remember the moment when arrogance tried to write the story, and Jasmine Crockett calmly, fearlessly, and unmistakably rewrote it. The video title tells the truth of what unfolded. Blackburn insulted intelligence, but it was Crockett who left the room, speechless, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with something far stronger. Dignity sharpened into truth. That's the lesson that still echoes. In the end, arrogance is loud, but it is never lasting. Dignity, when it stands tall, doesn't just win. The moment it defines it, and in Crockett's steady voice, millions heard a message for themselves. You don't need to bow to arrogance, because truth will always speak louder. So now, it's your turn. If you believe dignity must always defeat arrogance, share this video. Let Crockett's words travel further than the chamber walls. Let them remind others, friends, co-workers, family, that arrogance only wins when dignity stays silent. Subscribe to this channel, because together we are documenting the moments where truth breaks through, where the underestimated rise, and where the story of America is being rewritten before our eyes. Be part of that movement. Be part of amplifying the voices that refuse to be silenced, because arrogance will always try again. But as long as dignity has an audience like you, it will never stand unchallenged. If you believe in truth over arrogance and respect, over ridicule, and voices like Jasmine Crockett's shaping the future, then don't just watch. Join us, share, subscribe, and let's keep rewriting history one story at a time.